Hello and welcome to my little home studio. Today, I will be walking you through the process behind a watercolor bouquet that I painted during my baby's nap time. Now, nap times are so precious for me because it's the only time I can actually steal some daylight, and at the same time, it also gives me the chance to unwind and re-energize through painting flowers. Choosing the size that I want to paint is probably one of the first steps, and I love painting really large. So this here is an A3 size sheet that you're seeing me paint in, and this gives me a lot more movement, and I feel like if I'm going to be painting a huge bouquet, it also means that I get to use bigger brushes and I don't have to worry about the smaller details because everything is a lot more enlarged. Color selection is probably the next step where we are thinking about what color palette you would like to have when you're painting. And I love using watercolor inks. So you see that I'm putting my inks down in this little pill box that I got from a $2 store. And this pill box has enabled me to have most of my inks in there, and then I would transfer whatever inks I would like on my mixing plate and mix them with my existing watercolor palette paints before I get started. The first stroke that we always put down is probably one of the hardest to do, specifically because the paper is so big and we're not sure where exactly to start. Should I start on the top, at the bottom? It can feel very overwhelming, especially when you choose to use a much larger sheet of paper. So I would often just start with a flower that I really like in my reference photo. However, this is the funny thing. So many of the time, my first flower is always the most overworked flower. It's always the flower I call the warm-up flower, where many of the time we're just getting started and our hands are still stiff. You don't have that movement yet, or you don't really have that rhythm going yet. So that's my first flower for you. At this stage of the painting, I'm really just mapping out floral shapes and leaf placements. I'm figuring out where I want my flowers to be based on my reference photo, and I might not necessarily be following the reference photo exactly as it is. I'm using my own license to decide where I want my florals to be placed, and by doing the first wash of wet paint on paper, this gives me the ability to sort of visualize and get a sense of how various colors go together as well as shapes. I'm using this huge cat's tongue brush that I bought from Silver Black Velvet, and in this painting, it's the first time I was trying it out. I had never used a cat's tongue brush before, but I was always very intrigued by the shape and how it's got this really nice point, but at the same time you get really large washes from it as well. This bouquet has a couple of white flowers, and white is quite a difficult flower to capture in watercolor. However, I also feel like white is really a reflection of all other colors. So here I've used a little bit of warm gray to help me with getting this white color, and the warm gray that I'm using is from Snidelier. Sometimes I find that mixing complementary colors and getting that dirty color would also help with getting your kind of grayish, dirty shade. And this is where you can experiment, and often it's just really light wash. To get your whites to stand out, you will need a contrast in your greens, so darker greens, and of course your yellow centers or whatever color centers that you're going to have, because that's going to help you to identify where exactly the center of the flower is, and all of those surrounding greenery is really going to highlight and create that contrast between white and other colors. After mapping out the shape, I think that I start to eyeball which areas of my painting have started to dry, because then I start to consider adding layers. I find that playing around with the speed in which we're painting, whether it's going a little faster or taking your time with some nice slow strokes, can really help you to kind of see the different effects that you can get. I feel like when we use a lot quicker and faster brush strokes, your viewer also sees things with that movement. On the other hand, when you are painting something slowly, I think the viewer can also sense all of that dedication and that slowness there too. And I feel like your brush strokes carry all of those energies and also moods as you are painting. I was first drawn to painting watercolor flowers because I feel like the shapes that flowers come in are often really organic, so there's no real right or wrong way of doing things. And I think with loose florals, that's where you can really call a blob a flower, just as long as you make sure that you add a center. But that being said, I've never really been great at symmetry, so if you're talking about painting proportions like animals and portraits, this was always something that I never felt I was good at, even as a kid when I was doing art. So my feeling around painting a subject is always about figuring out what makes you feel good and starting from there, because so often many of us want to paint and we want to do so many things, but at the same time we also get trapped in the mindset where we want something to work in a certain way, but it's not really going that way. Now, I wanted to talk about that because when I started painting flowers, one of the things that I did was I went into tutorials to look how people were painting flowers, and of course, the 5-petal flower often came up, and while it looked really easy and fun to do, I also felt like my skills were limited, and I started to experience some imposter syndrome because a part of me felt like I was painting in somebody else's style, and being able to follow someone's step-by-step tutorial just made me feel more stuck instead because I couldn't find my own voice as an artist. So while I was able to apply techniques, I also felt like I was trapped in figuring out how to create my own voice. And this is where my exploration with painting with reference photos started to come in. Reference photos help me to identify where I should put in my detail. And in the beginning, when I first used a reference photo, I think my biggest difficulty was probably trying to discount and remove detail, because wanting to paint loosely means that I shouldn't add too much detail. And of course, as I said, our mind wants to pick up everything to make sure that things make sense. So I had to untrain my brain to pick every detail and paint every single thing, and only start to see things in a big picture or in shapes instead. My favorite stage of the painting is probably this, where I'm adding in layers, and I feel like this really helps to bring each flower to life. I can go in with different colors and different strokes to give the flower more definition. Painting in layers was something that I only discovered after I had kids. So the funny thing was that before I used to just paint in one layer and call it done, and I didn't know that watercolor had that versatility to layer as well. I used to have that impression that layering was only used in acrylics or oils, because you could actually add white to it and you can add lighter shades and colors to it. So layering really came after I only managed to finish paintings in 30-minute pockets or sometimes 20 minutes, and that was because, as I said when I started this video, I only paint during the pockets of time that my kids are napping. And sometimes my kids don't nap. My firstborn, she didn't nap. She was a 37-minute child. Like, she would always wake up at 37 minutes. It was one of the most tiring times of my life. And the funny thing is that you always see pictures of babies sleeping, but my baby never slept. Like, she would fight every nap, and then she would get so overtired, and then eventually she would fall asleep, but she only gave me 37 minutes. So I actually stopped painting when I had my firstborn, and I only resumed painting after my thirdborn. And thankfully with my third one, She managed to nap at least an hour, so I often had that pocket of 1 hour, but you don't actually get started painting right away when you get to your table. It takes time to figure out your colors and figure out your reference photo. So during that time, I would often just be mapping out my big shapes, and I would only get to layering at a much later stage, and I only discovered it because when my kids interrupted my art, I would come back to it with fresher eyes, and I would then add on more colors and more layers. And this is where I had developed a system that worked not just for my art but for my role as a mom as well. And it showed me that it was still possible to create art and develop a new system of painting, which I was not used to. And that's the thing about new discoveries. I think that the whole part about layering really transformed the way I saw watercolor's potential. At the same time, I feel like I've gotten to know the medium a lot more. So I started to pay attention to my paint water ratios. I started to learn about various pigments, what pigments were best for layering, or even the way in which my paints moved, whether it was in different stages of my paper drying. There was so much more learning just because I had discovered a new way to paint. The hardest part to loose florals is knowing when to stop. And I think that so many of us struggle with how much detail we should have, whether or not you should add more or less. And this is where my advice would be that in loose florals, it's better that a painting looks unfinished than overdone. This is if you want to do it in a loose floral style. So many of the time, I've added in more detail than I wanted, and I've overworked my painting. So I would encourage you to walk away from your painting and sometimes give it a day or two to breathe before you actually move on. Now, every end of my painting, I would always write the date and sign because I want to remember when exactly this painting was done, and it also helps me to go back one day and see my own progress. Sharing with you the process of this painting and you watching it take shape really made this piece so special. Thank you for joining me here today, and I'd love to hear what were some of your insights that you took away as you watched me paint. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment box below, and I can't wait for us to paint together again. Until then, stay inspired.